Good morning. I am so happy to be here introducing the sixth in our webinar series on building the new forest future. The Northern Forest Center has been running these webinars for a while now, bi-monthly conversations about how people and organizations are creating positive change in Northern Forest communities. The topic today has to do with recreation on private lands, which introduces all kinds of interesting challenges that don't exist in many parts of the country, where a lot of recreation takes place on public lands where things can be a lot more simple. On private lands, we deal with a lot of things like how do you secure permanent access, who do you allow there, what are liability issues, and most of all, it comes down to relationships. What kind of relationships do users have with the land, with the landowners? How do you maintain positive communication along the way? And how do you make it possible for people to enjoy this beautiful natural resource while maintaining respect and positivity with the people who own the land? So we're going to hear some really, really great stories from our panelists today. As we go, I encourage you to put questions into the Q&A box. My colleagues who are on this call with me, Amy Scott, Leslie Carrison, and Isabella Ronson, are going to be helping monitor that and feeding us questions. We'll start, as we always do, with some brief comments from our panelists who are going to share some basic stories about their places and their experience. Then we're going to get into a conversation between them. And we had a preparatory call last week where it became very clear that there's ample conversation to be had on this topic, and we all have a lot to learn from each other. And we're going to wrap up then with getting into some of the questions that you may have for them. So again, I encourage you to put questions into the Q&A as opposed to the chat so that we can manage those and make sure that things get answered as best they can. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists today. We have Abby Long, who's the Executive Director of Kingdom Trail Association in East Burke, Vermont. Josh Wilson is the Executive Director of Barkeater Trails Alliance in Saranac Lake, New York. Mike Morin is the Northeast Director for the Access Fund. And we have Sean Ross from Lyme Timber joining us, who is also we're proud to have him as a board member from the Northern Forest Center. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're just working on making sure everyone can get video. All right, wonderful. So we're going to start today with just an introduction from Abby, talking about what she has been, what she sees at Kingdom Trails, what Kingdom Trails is, and how she has been seeing the land. So Abby, take it away.
Thanks, Morin. I'm honored to go first. My name is Abby Long. I'm the Executive Director for the Kingdom Trail Association. And first, thank you all for attending, and of course, the Northern Forest Center. As KT is always so grateful for the opportunity to share our story, especially when it's about our private landowners. So to begin, Kingdom Trails is a nonprofit trail organization. We are located in Vermont's beautiful Northeast Kingdom. And please know that KT does recognize that we are founded and built upon lands first inhabited by the indigenous people of this region, which are the Abenaki. And now the 100+ mile trail system, which spans 4 towns and 2 counties, is deeply intertwined with our local community, as it was our own community members who banded together to develop our multi-use trail system. And ever since our founding in 1994, we've been dedicated to our mission, which is providing recreation and education opportunities by managing, maintaining, and building trails to foster the health of our local community, surrounding environment, and regional economy. And before I go any further, and the reason that we are all here today, I cannot stress enough that our trails are solely made possible by now 104 private landowners who so generously allow our trails to cross their properties. These neighbors, my own neighbors even, which I'm always like in awe that on either side of me, I have KT private landowners. They see the vision, they see the asset, see the positive impact that Kingdom Trails is having in one of the most economically and socially challenged regions of our state, in our country for that matter. And so quick, the Northern Forest Center asked us to share some of our greatest challenges. And since I'm the ever optimist, I don't view this as a challenge. Rather, I feel our private landowners are what make KT special, so unique, and what Maura said sets us apart from the rest of the country. Yet the 104 relationships that we have with our private landowners, we must absolutely consider them with every decision that we make. It's a huge responsibility. I'm always asking, I feel, what will the impact be on our landowners and their properties? Because I have to be honest, KT has had experience firsthand that what could happen if landowners are not at the forefront. And that leads me to a little story, of course, that yes, KT is a remarkable recreation resource with incredible economic impact, with over $10 million annually into our region. However, KT wholeheartedly acknowledges that this level of use places pressure on the rural village infrastructure, on our neighbors and our private landowners. So as many are aware, over 2 years ago now, KT experienced 3 landowners. They restricted access to mountain bikers on their properties. And the reason being inappropriate behavior by trail users. And this was devastating to me, to our trail users, to our community, to other landowners. Yet again, ever optimist, the silver lining, we have learned so much and improved greatly. And that's what I'm really hoping to get down to today and share about our increased communication and education efforts, adopting a code of conduct, Ride with Gratitude, hiring more ambassadors to be present on the trails, to hold trail users accountable, protecting and valuing our private landowners. We need trail users to understand that it is not their right to be on these trails, rather it's a privilege. So
Thanks,
we'll get into the nitty-gritty later.
I'm going to share my screen for a second just to give people who don't know a sense of just how serious these trail networks are. So this is a pretty phenomenal trail network, and if folks haven't been there yet, I highly recommend it. But you'll notice that even on these maps, there's the Ride with Gratitude tenets on both of them. There's the very clear thank you private landowners. There's the very clear calls to ride single file while on roads. So everywhere they can, Kingdom Trails is trying to instill this sense of responsibility among trail users and acknowledge its private landowners. So I will stop that for now, and we will go to Mike.
Great, thanks, Maura. So yeah, my name is Mike Morin. I'm the Northeast Regional Director for the Access Fund. A little bit about the Access Fund. We are the national nonprofit that works to keep climbing areas open and conserved across the United States. So our work spans the nation. However, I'm based in Glen, New Hampshire, and my Northeastern region really covers what would be considered probably the tri-state, mid-Atlantic, and up into New England regions. But today, really, my emphasis is definitely going to be focusing in on our northern New England region, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, where we do have a tremendous amount of tremendous amount of rock climbing that occurs on private land. And across the broader Northeast region, as the Access Fund defines it, we certainly work with private landowners. But here in northern New England, it's definitely a unique situation, both from the way that access has typically been allowed for generations, and just the way that recreation occurs in those lands outside of just climbing. Our work in general really spans 6 core program areas. And I'll note that because we're a national organization, we rely heavily on local, we call local climbing organizations. And here in those three kind of northern New England areas I mentioned, we have the Clifton Climbers Alliance in eastern Maine. We have the Friends of the Ledges here in the Mount Washington Valley, New Hampshire. We have the Rumney Climbers Association, based in kind of central Rumney, New Hampshire. Monadnock Climbers Association in southwestern New Hampshire and Keene. Crag Vermont, which covers the entire state of Vermont, has been doing really good work on land conservation over the years. In fact, all these organizations I just mentioned have been doing tremendous work in that space, really out of necessity, because we don't interact a lot with federal land managers. That we do have the White Mountain and Green Mountain National Forests here in the region that certainly contain climbing and other recreational opportunities.
Mike, do you want me to share your slides at some point?
But
if you're fine.
I'm fine to just roll. It's all good.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah, just forget to roll into it. It's all good.
Go
And so I think one of the things that, in terms of thinking about some of the challenges and opportunities that we have here, I think that one of the biggest ones is the fact that land can change hands over the course of over a given amount of time. Sometimes it's a generation, sometimes it's a matter of years. And oftentimes when that land changes hands, we are faced with access challenges. We might have a permissible landowner who's allowed access for many years, and then that land changes hands and the priorities are different with that new landowner. Or sometimes a land use change happens, which might conflict with recreational access, or without some creative problem solving. So it's definitely a very dynamic landscape. It keeps the work interesting for sure. Working in public land advocacy and conservation certainly has its own challenges as well, but certainly private land management and access adds a whole other layer of unique challenges that we get to face and figure out creative solutions for. So yeah, that's kind of a high level overview of the Access Fund. And I'll just say that, another piece of our solution or toolbox is that because we are an accredited land trust, we actually are able to work to acquire land. So that is a big piece of what we do at the Access Fund, is when we do have the opportunity to acquire lands through fee acquisition or working with another private or entity like a land trust, we definitely embrace that, because that, in a sense, gives us some stability in the future of what this land will be used for, if we can work to establish conservation easements or other tools that can ensure recreational access, along with ensuring the land won't be developed. So that's kind of a high level overview of our work.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. And as someone who is not a climber, it's been really interesting to think about how this shows up differently for climbers. You talked when we talked earlier about how it's not, you can't go anywhere else. The crag is the crag. If you lose access to the crag, like, there are others, but it's not like it presents some special challenges that we'll get into.
For sure. And I'll just note that one of the opportunities is it's a resource it exists, right? So when you're building mountain bike trails, it relies on so many miles of trails for it to be a resource. And we're lucky in that the rocks are out there, the boulders are out there. We just need to figure out how to access them sustainably. And
Cool. So next we're going to Sean Ross, who is here from Lyme Timber Company, representing a large landowner perspective, coming at this from a different angle.
Yeah, thanks, Morin. So Sean Ross, I'm with the Lyme Timber Company. We're based down in Hanover, New Hampshire. We own about 1.5 million acres in the eastern US, including about 240,000 acres in the Adirondacks. And one kind of unique thing about the Lyme Timber Companies, we have participated in, as the private landowner side, in a number of large working forest conservation easements in the Northeast, and helped conserve, I'd say it's maybe 600,000 acres-ish, Maine, New Hampshire, and New York. And one of the biggest driving factors of those conservation easements was public access, the fear that as these big blocks, historically paper company owned lands, changed hands to private investors, that folks that lived in those regions and recreated on those properties would be essentially blocked out from using them. So very proud of our work securing access to those properties and also ensuring that they are sustainably managed in terms of the forest resource. Probably one of the biggest challenges, though, as you can imagine, with a large kind of iconic property is all the different uses that people want to see occur on those ownerships. And we work closely with the easement holder, which is typically a state agency, to implement recreational uses and access to the lands. But I think, as we all know, there's more and more people getting outside. There's more and more uses of types of recreation to do outside, and it's a challenge to balance the desire for access with what the resource can sustain. I'll turn it back over to you, Mara.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Josh Wilson from Barkeater Trails Alliance, also in the Adirondacks, where you have private land and layers of difficulty accessing state land. So he has layers of challenge that other people don't. So Josh.
Hi, everybody. Josh Wilson here from the Barkeater Trails Alliance. I'm happy to be here, and thanks to the Northern Forest Center for hosting this important conversation. Barkeater Trails, we also go by Beta, is an organization with a 35-year history of kind of a dual mission of ski touring and mountain biking, and also accommodating a lot of other human-powered activities on the trails that we work on. We really work to build, maintain, and advocate for a system of both community and backcountry-based trails in the eastern, northeastern, and High Peaks region of the Adirondacks. As Morin mentioned, there's a real patchwork of land ownership in the Adirondack Park, and our trail systems reflect that. We work on state forest preserve lands and municipal lands, as well as private lands, and much of this is interconnected. So a lot of the trail systems are often using one or all three of those land ownerships. We're working across 2 counties in about 10 different towns and villages. And we really accomplish this work through mostly through volunteers. We have a small staff, 2 full-time or 2 year-round staff, and a seasonal trail crew. And just thinking more about the private land, we have a really long history because of our founding of our organization being in the mid-'80s to create a town-to-town ski trail, which we'll be talking about today. So we have this really interesting scenario where we've had some landowners with over a 30-year history of access in our trail system, combined with some newer properties that we've gained access to, either for the development of entire trail networks or connections between those networks. And one thing that we place a lot of emphasis on is trying to connect our hamlet areas to the trail systems that surround them. Whether that's state land or private or municipal, we work really hard to make sure that people can ride and run and ski right from where they live or from where they're staying in a hotel onto these trail systems. And that just really frequently involves working with private landowners to form those connections. Like I said, we have a dual mission of mountain biking and skiing, and there's just so many different projects and trails to talk about. I think the things I wanted to emphasize was just that, every situation is different when it comes to working with a private landowner. And we literally have the full gamut here, from large acreages with whole trail systems with 10+ miles of trails on them to a corner of somebody's lot with a 25-foot section of trail so that we can get between two properties. So we're really working on various scales. And today I'm really going to focus more, I think, on the Jackrabbit Ski Trail, which is probably our best example of success with working with private landowners, and a really long history of maintaining that trail since it was established in 1986. The Jackrabbit is a 42-mile town-to-town ski touring route that connects 4 hamlet areas, connects Nordic centers and other recreational trail opportunities. And it really relies on private land parcels and agreements with landowners to connect between these larger parcels of public land. And so that's where probably our longest history of working with landowners. And like I said, each situation is so different, and our access agreements reflect that as well. I mean, we are working with everything from situations where we've been able to establish a permanent easement for access across private property, to annual license agreements that we negotiate with landowners individually, and all the way down to simple handshake agreements for access to different lands. The last thing I'll say is just, I think probably with many places in the Northeast and around the country, we're experiencing a lot of issues with access to those private lands, but also just trail use in general. And that really stems from increases in trail use. We're seeing like a lot of places, an explosion in outdoor recreation, and that applies to mountain biking and skiing as well. We definitely saw some impacts from the pandemic and the sort of COVID bump on outdoor trails, pressure on crowding at trailheads and access points where we're relying on private land, and lastly, just changes in land ownership and real estate development that is sort of changing the use of these private sections of trail over time. So there's a lot to discuss here, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so as you can tell, there's a lot to get into here. And we'll go back to gallery view so we can see everyone at once. But I'm interested maybe to start off with a question about what are the benefits to landowners for granting access to recreation? And you own 50 acres and you might go walking on it sometimes, and you might do a timber harvest occasionally, or you own 240,000 acres in the Adirondacks. Why would you let strangers go on your land and recreate? And this is a question for everyone.
I would throw out there that I think it's just part of being part of a community. It's being, it's being responsive of what your neighbors want to do, what you own, and what is making it available.
This is something I grapple with every day. For KT private landowners, the benefits, of course, we are publicly thanking our landowners every day on social media. We have an annual appreciation celebration in honor of them. But the truth of the matter is that private landowners in Vermont, I should speak specifically to, receive no financial benefit for having trails on their land. Really the benefit, to echo Sean, is other than the knowledge that they are contributing to uplifting their community. That's their main benefit. But we're actually in Vermont not able to compensate our landowners due to state statute of landowner liability protection, which I can speak to later. But this worries me. I believe that will need to change in the near future. especially if Vermont specifically wishes to continue to promote itself to the world as the outdoor recreation capital of the Northeast. And my wish for Vermont is that they will need to realize soon that the backbone of these recreation opportunities are being made possible by private landowners, and they should be appreciated properly by receiving some sort of benefit in order for these opportunities to continue to be sustainable. And so I do like to kind of play around and brainstorm ways of getting around this compensation so I don't risk their liability. There are things I like to discuss at the state level about a possible tax credit similar to the forest use value or the current use program that Vermont has. I really think that should be explored. And I would love to see recreation added to that program. If we consider our taxes as a debt paid to society, then one could say that these landowners' debt should be a little less as they're providing this benefit to the public. Other things I like to explore, and this is totally new to me, and I'm still in the education wave of this, but is carbon sequestration, those types of tax credits. Could our landowners almost form a group, especially our larger landowners, and put the carbon inventory that they have on their properties out onto the market and receive a benefit in return for that. And again, that wouldn't be KT directly compensating them. So their landowner liability protection would still be intact. And then other ways, looking kind of outside the box, it's not quite a benefit, but it's more of a way KT can continue to protect our landowners is, again, very Vermont specific, but there's a little thing called Act 250 in our state. And this is a law to protect the environment in balance with sustainable development. And trail groups in Vermont believe that there needs to be some more clarification as how Act 250 is being applied to recreational trails. And our landowners have made it very clear that they do not want the uncertainty of Act 250 jurisdiction that could be applied to their properties because of our trails. So Act 250, as it currently is structured, is not well suited for recreational trail oversight. And my job to benefit our landowners is to protect them. And therefore, I continue to just stay involved in those state level conversations and maybe some legislation advocacy regarding Act 250, again, for our trails, the future of our trails and our landowners.
I just add that Abby makes a good point about the compensation side, and it isn't uniform across the Northeast. Some states do allow for landowners to be compensated for leasing out or selling recreational access. So that's a unique part of Vermont's current use program.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. Oh, go right ahead, Josh. Sorry.
I'll just say really quickly, I would just second that, that community benefit. I think that's pretty prevalent among all the landowners we work with. They really recognize that they're contributing something to the larger community and are usually pretty excited to do that. And also, on a lighter note, just if that person is a trail user, then, they benefit from having active stewardship of the trails on their land by a trail organization or local volunteers or whoever's doing that work, which can be a benefit to them as well.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly say that, yeah, I think I found it often to be a point of pride for private landowners when they have a valued resource on their land that people are excited to visit and appreciative of visiting. And then I think having responsible outdoor recreationists on the land can be a great benefit to landowners, and that there's an extra set of eyes and ears out there on the land. We find that on public land too, but certainly on private land, going into some of these remote Western Maine areas, for instance, where you might not get to, or even a smaller property here in the Mount Washington Valley. And kind of dovetailing on what Josh was alluding to, stewardship for sure. We have these organized groups that are spread out across, and for the climbing community, particularly, our climbing areas are vast and spread across a broad region. And so these areas that are heavily visited and cherished frequently see organized stewardship days, whether it's picking up litter or trail work. And so just caring for the land is definitely, hopefully, a benefit to the landowner.
And they also get sweet trails built up, well, for trails organizations, get some nice trails built on their land. So there is kind of a personal benefit there too, if they're interested in doing things like that. So I'm interested in hearing about what are some of your favorite or effective strategies in working with user groups. And maybe I'll start with Sean on this. Is, you know, you have a lot of, whether it's motorized or hikers or equestrians or different user groups trying to use Lyme lands. What are some of the best ways you've found to interface with them, and what challenges have you run into?
I think the most important thing is to show up and meet and have a conversation and make sure everybody understands basically what people are asking for, what, you know, making sure people understand what the limitations of the use are. You know, just having a conversation to get things started, as opposed to just presuming that this is allowed or this is not allowed, or that this is going to work or this is not going to work. But and so the flip side of that is, I think the biggest challenges that we've run into is when groups just presume that something's open or that they can do this use. And you know, it's always, I'm sure everybody will speak to this, it's always a very small number of users that ruin it for the rest of the users.
And how does, you know, with the very extensive landholding that Lyme has, and as, you know, a forestry organization, how do you start those conversations?
Yeah,
how do people know who to talk to?
Yeah, and it's unique in our specific situation because the state of New York, in terms of our Adirondack property, they're the ones that actually hold the right to allow the public to recreate on the property under certain limitations. So they are the interface that the public goes through, and they do a reasonably good job of holding, you know, stakeholder meetings and getting input and writing management plans and getting feedback on that, and then working with us to implement those plans. But I think it's helpful for us as the landowner to also show up and engage, because, you know, those uses are going to be on our property eventually. So being part of that conversation from the start is how we engage with the public.
How have others of you either cultivated good personal strategies for working with landowners, or facilitated conversations amongst user groups or the community that have worked well?
I can chime in. You know, it depends, I think, on the landowner, the size, if it's a large company, corporation, or an individual landowner. With individual landowners, I've really found that, you know, finding those personal points of contact, if you can find them, to make those introductions, you know, create an intro to the conversation, kind of vouching for your status as a respected organization or a group of people that we're going to use the land appropriately. I've also had good success working similarly with land trust organizations here in the region. Again, they're a known quantity, oftentimes more well known than, say, the Access Fund, which is very esoteric and focused on climbing, or another local climbing organization. So, and oftentimes those land trusts have developed relationships in conserved lands that property owner may have formerly owned, and so they have a working relationship. So trying to leverage those relationships to achieve, you know, conservation and access priorities has definitely been a good strategy. And then with larger landholders, oftentimes it's showing up and sending a really well-crafted you know, letter that shows that we have the chops to understand what it takes to manage land, what the various tools are in the toolbox for land conservation, whether it's acquisitions, easements, and just or something more, even more informal, like just an MOU, but just showing up in professional fashion and hopefully starting a conversation and having a successful kind of relationship building process.
I'll just chime in quick and sort of second what Sean said about there being a challenge, and I think this is especially true in the Adirondacks, where, you know, especially visitors coming to the Adirondack Park, maybe it's just assumption that anything that's open to the public must be public land. And we have a situation where we have, you know, a lot of access points to state forest preserve land are located on private lands. So really the access is only there because the landowner is allowing public use to cross to get to that point. And so we've been working, especially the last couple of years, to try to improve signage at those boundaries, you know, doing better with our mapping, showing the difference between public and private lands on maps, and also started to sign on to the Ride with Gratitude campaign and use some of the messaging developed, you know, by KT and the Bike the Borderlands to help educate our trail users about, you know, you may be on private land, and this is different than you know, going to a public land trail system.
Yeah, John, I'm going to turn to Abby in a second about how you have used the Ride with Gratitude and other messaging so well with your constituents, but I'll just interject quickly. The Bike Borderlands that Josh referenced is something that the Northern Forest Center facilitates. It's a collaboration between 9 different mountain bike or different trail organizations primarily focused on mountain biking in northern New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, and southern Quebec, that we work together to strengthen and promote mountain biking in that region. And a couple of years ago, prompted by the incident at Kingdom Trails that Abby referenced earlier, decided to work together on developing some kind of campaign that would help develop a more respectful mountain biking culture. And my colleague Kelsey, I think, just put a link to some of the information about Ride with Gratitude into the chat. We have a pledge that you can take online, kind of affirming that this is a privilege, that we need to feel grateful for being able to use trails, use private land. And we've had a great reception to Ride with Gratitude so far. A lot of people are really interested in hearing more about it, but primarily championed by Kingdom Trails. So Abby, I'll turn it to you to talk about how you've used that and anything else you have around how you have been able to communicate effectively, both with landowners and with the user groups.
No, I mean, just to continue with the Ride with Gratitude Love Fest, we're so grateful to Bike Borderlands and the Northern Forest Center for uniting that mountain bike collaborative to create that code of conduct, because it's not just Kingdom Trails on their own preaching. We knew voices of multiple networks in the region were stronger together. And now if, you know, someone goes to recreate over in Craftsbury and then the next day they come over to KT, they're getting it in their face double. And what I also love about the Code of Conduct campaign is Bike Borderlands is able to extend it beyond just the recreation opportunity. They're also having relationships with the area businesses and the municipalities. And so Cafe Lottie, which is the wonderful coffee in downtown East Burke, you walk in there before you even hit the trails, go to the bathroom, and the Ride with Gratitude symbol is like on the back of the stall, staring back at your face. So there's no way around it. And so that campaign has just been such a gift and a tool that then KT and along with Bike Borderlands can just holistically communicate with our trail users. And I sometimes joke about we are communicating until we're blue in the face and then we keep going because it will never stop. We will always have to continue to communicate this message because engagement and education is on proper trail etiquette and holding them accountable. That's the other flip side of it all, is the one way that we can continue to value and protect our private landowners. So along with all that messaging that Josh and Mike and Sean have mentioned, you know, signage and social media and logos of Ride with Gratitude, we also have expanded our already existing ambassador program. And so this is the KT team, paid staff members who are out starting in our welcome center and then out in parking lots and then out on the trails. And they are sharing the new code of conduct, leave no trace policies, and informing users that they are on private property and to be respectful. And we've increased the numbers of those ambassadors and stationing them in key locations, and just having a stronger presence out there, I think has truly been a big shift in seeing more positive trail interactions and behaviors out in our community.
If I could dovetail on the education piece just a bit, you know, in the climbing space, we've seen, I think, similar growth in terms of numbers and people getting outdoors, especially around the pandemic. But even before that, we were seeing extensive growth in the activity. And so similarly, I think every outdoor user group probably has gone through this exercise at some point, but trying to figure out that messaging around what your community needs to know in terms of respectfully accessing the land, regardless of ownership or management type. And so the Access Fund several years ago, created the Climbers Pact. And so very similar, I think, to the Ride with Gratitude. I'll drop that in if I can, drop that in the chat. But really, yeah, built off of the foundation of Leave No Trace, but also including things like iconography that land managers and private landowners can implement in kiosks, and some templates as well for kiosk panels to help try to lower the barrier for helping out a land manager or private landowner as they're trying to communicate with whoever the user group, the climbers in this instance, are visiting their property and helping them understand what the expectations for use are.
Thank
Morin,
you.
can I mention one more?
Yes, please.
Educational piece that goes kind of to that holistic approach that I referred to. Something very new that KT's established is our community chat series. And so this is just another avenue that KT's using to like get in the face of folks. But it's actually not, our trail users are welcome, but it's actually more of a tactic for community members who might not be trail users. And also our landowners are welcome to attend as well. But it goes along with our renewed commitment to consistent communication. And I basically, myself, along with board members and KT leadership team members, make ourselves available. We park ourselves in Cafe Lottie or the Orange Vine or the Tiki Bar, or other area businesses around the network. And we are there to, of course, share what's happening with KT, but we're really there to just be open to questions, concerns, suggestions, visions, and they're casual. They're really fun gatherings, and we've only been doing them for about a year now, but the participation's been wonderful, and I think it's been just having that open communication between an organization and their community and their landowners and their trail users is huge.
Yeah, Maura, could I add that obviously it's clear that this stuff takes work, takes effort, and takes organization. I think if you go back, I don't know how many years, maybe it's 30 years or 40 years, but snowmobiling in Vermont faced a similar challenge, and they organized around thanking private landowners. That's been vast. The Vermont Association of Snow Travelers was formed, and it was addressing a lot of those same issues at the time. Is that the whole network depended on private landowners, and there needed to be messaging and getting out ahead of this. And so it's not just mountain bikes, it's any sort of kind of concentrated regular use. It's educating the landowners, it's educating the users. We actually, to add on to the Ride with Gratitude stories, we have some land in Tennessee that has an active ATV trail network, and they were really struggling. It was like, they were telling me the story, it's on our property. It's like, this is exactly what KT went through a couple of years ago. It's just ATVs, so it's, it's louder and higher impact. And I pointed them to the Ride with Gratitude, and they actually came up with their own kind of approach that is very similar and rolled that out and have, again, organization and effort, holding these community meetings, talking with the landowners, really listening. And it's made a difference, because then the people in the community feel like they're being heard and the private landowners feel like they're being heard.
That's awesome. I hadn't known that about the ATVs coming in with their own pledge based on Ride with Gratitude. And they could use just Ride with Gratitude too, a little different message, but I love that. And thank you. Other folks I see, Tyler Ray, Susan Adams have put in a couple comparable pledges or things, and we will collect those and circulate them in the follow-up email. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, please put those in the Q&A. We will get those pretty soon. But I want to get back to this question about liability and how you deal with landowners being concerned about, like, well, what if somebody breaks their leg on my trail? I could envision people being pretty concerned about that, even when there are state laws that protect them. How have you how has that shown up in the work you do? Maybe starting with Josh.
Sure. Yeah, like you say, even when the law is strong and in New York, the protections for private landowners are quite robust in our general obligations law, which is the recreational use statute that allows for public use of private lands. But my experience has been that that's usually a pretty black and white issue when it comes to individual landowners. Either the person is aware of the law or not, but is simply not that concerned, or it's a hard no. And I would say it's pretty difficult to at least in our experience, to turn that around when the person is a hard no and is very concerned about that liability issue. Some ways that we try to address that, obviously just trying to have a dialogue with the landowner, sharing the laws, sharing resources, interpreting the laws for private landowners. We carry pretty substantial liability policy that covers our activities on private lands, and we'll add private landowners to that policy if they request it. That in and of itself can become an issue for an organization like ours, especially a small nonprofit, where we've faced situations where landowners have, or their lawyers have, basically said, we'll allow this if you are able to provide a certain amount of coverage, which costs, which is an expensive prospect for a small nonprofit. So there's this sort of base level liability coverage. Once you start to increase the limits of that coverage, the costs go up astronomically, and there has been, at least in New York, at least with our insurance coverage, pretty serious increase in the costs. I would say in the last 5 years, our insurance costs have tripled for that same kind of coverage. So that's I think a larger issue with insurance markets, and especially when you start talking about recreational trails and the different activities that take place on them and how that affects the coverage, and especially with skiing. Honestly, like skiing is for whatever reason become a big red flag for insurance underwriters.
Yeah, I think Josh, you nailed it. That's kind of the same model that Kingdom Chills is based off of. KT landowners, we have up to 4 layers of liability protection for them. First, I already mentioned the most critical layer really is that robust protection afforded to landowners under Vermont's, it's called the Limitation on Landowner Liability Statute, or recreational use law. And this defines the parameters around which liability protections afforded to landowners who open their land to public access, or water too is actually falls under that. So that's really special about Vermont, that's allowed. And then second, just as Josh shared, KT landowners enjoy a protection as additionally insured under our liability insurance coverage. And we're covering them up to $5 million, which includes an umbrella policy. And again, costs have increased, and we've even increased our coverage due to the request of landowners. And third, we put it on the landowners. We actually encourage them to check in with their own insurance agent or company to confirm their homeowner policy. We'll also, because usually they will also protect against liability claims arising out of the use of their property. And then finally, there is a liability waiver, release of liability and assumption of risk document that KT trail users must sign to be granted membership and access to the Kingdom Trails trail, the network. So we're very confident in those 4 layers that that our landowners are protected. However, I've noticed it in the past 2 years, and I think it's due to COVID. All rural areas have been experiencing an influx of folks from away, folks, maybe city folk, escaping the cities and wanting to, live, work, and play in the Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, which we all want. We want people moving here because our population is in decline. But folks from outside of Vermont moving in are maybe not confident or not knowledgeable in our state statute. And that is another educational piece that KT's increasing. So they are understanding that they are protected and that this open policy use is acceptable in Vermont, and they can be confident in it. But again, it's work on our behalf to message that.
So Mike, go ahead, Sean.
I was just to be super clear, the landowner liability protection laws they're fairly common throughout the Northeast, but Abby made the point earlier that they require that the landowner provide free open access to their land. So as soon as you charge anything, that protection that's afforded by the state goes away. Yeah.
And Mike, as someone who deals with all kinds of different states, how is there any great variation between them? And someone is asking in the Q&A for any kind of resources, especially in Maine and New Hampshire, around information or interpretation of those laws, and asking as well if Abby maybe has a summary sheet explaining the different layers of protection. So, but starting with how this differs between the states, Mike, and whether there are sort of easy resources people could go to understand what those liability laws are.
Yeah, every state's a bit different, but as Sean noted, every state in the country has our rec use statute. Some are more robust than others. Maine and New Hampshire have really great statutes, and I'm not as familiar with Vermont, but it sounds like Vermont's is really good as well. But to get to the question of resources, one place you could look, Access Fund manages a third-party website called climbingmanagement.org. And it's a clearinghouse of research and studies, and it includes a link to all 50 rec use statutes and in their full legal description as they're written. So that's a good place for folks to check out. You can kind of navigate through the site to find that rec use statute page. But one of the things we do, and we've worked with volunteers locally, and we've spearheaded this as the Access Fund as a broader organization in some states as well, as we actively work to get climbing, bouldering, ice climbing listed explicitly in state rec use statutes. Some states, it's kind of, they have a catch-all, but even just having that, climbing listed specifically can go a long way when having that conversation with landowners. And then there are some states where if your activity is not listed, it's not covered explicitly. And so, but in general, I'd say in the states that, look at whether it's Pennsylvania, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, the rec statutes are there and they offer good protection. But yeah, sometimes it's a challenge to navigate, finding having folks feel comfortable with that single layer of protection, even though it is quite robust. And we do occasionally find landowners that understand that they are protected, and that's good enough for them. But oftentimes we do deploy these other tools that were mentioned.
Great, thank you.
I also shared a link in the chat to a paper from Cornell University. It's an analysis of recreational use statutes in each of the northern forest states. It's a little bit dated, but it gives a really good overview for each state and some of the limitations of the law, and it talks about some of the case law, and especially how the laws are interpreted for other entities that may or may not be considered private property, such as municipalities and, you know, trails on town land and things like that, that I've always found really helpful.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm interested in hearing you all talk about sort of synergies between landowners and working landscapes and recreation and forestry, that these things can all coexist. The Northern Forest Center is very much interested in seeing diverse use of the land base, where you can both you know, have a sugar bush and make maple syrup and practice forestry sometimes and have different kinds of recreation. These things can coexist. I actually think it's kind of a neat opportunity to educate people about who mostly just maybe mountain bike on a property, and then all of a sudden they see a timber cut and they're like, oh no, the trees, like actually this is good for all kinds of reasons, and it's kind of a neat way to educate people. But I'm wondering what you guys have seen in terms of how these multiple uses of the forest can coexist, and maybe protect or advance your ability to manage forests, either as a landowner or and when you're talking with others. And maybe as maybe let's start with Sean on that.
Sure. So full disclaimer, I'm also a forester. So I'm responsible for some of the tree harvesting that you see on our property. I think it is an opportunity, it is a challenge, but it gets back to, I think, the beginning of like this understanding that if you are recreating on private land base, that private landowners have a variety of things that they own the land for. Maybe for sugaring, and maybe they might generate timber income occasionally. And, you know, I think that you can do a lot of communication as to why and some of the benefits, but I think as a landowner that's managing the forest for timber, one thing that the landowner has responsibility for is that if you have invited people to use your property, whether it's a snowmobile trail or a hiking trail or a bike trail, is to be respectful of that resource as well. That it kind of goes both ways, that if you have agreed to allow that use and then you have a logging operation, you should do what you can to minimize the impact on that use. That includes, you know, crossing the trail with equipment or seasonal closures. Just there's ways that you can plan ahead and mimic or minimize the impacts. And I saw that. I went for a ride, a mountain bike ride up at Kingdom Trails, and there's always, you know, every year a landowner does a timber harvest. And, you know, I probably saw the details more than others, but I was like, oh, wow, they moved the skid trail so it parallels the bike trail. And they made a conscious decision to not impact the bike trail, but they still were able to do their timber harvest. And I thought that was great. And so that's part of it.
This is literally my favorite topic to share. And smooth segue since Sean brought up Kingdom Trails. Yeah, I love that term, and maybe the Northern Forest Center is who deemed it, but the new working landscape, because the Northeast Kingdom, you know, the traditional industry up here is the forest industry. But Kingdom Trails is giving it a run for its money with outdoor recreation, really being an economic driver as well. So Morris shared it, that the two have such synergy, and I believe actually complement each other. I don't think landowners ever have to choose one or the other. Just like Sean shared in his own observations at KT, we all it really takes is communication with the landowner and the forester of the landowner and the logging operator to get boots on the ground, share what's going to happen that winter once the ground's frozen. Where are the trails? We send our trail director out there flagging everything. And if the machines have to cross the trails, they cross at a 90-degree angle, or they're parallel to the trail. And really, it's so exciting, because when I think back to learning about KT's history, I mean, that's how KT was even founded, was on old logging roads. And every time there is a harvest, you know, maybe new trails are even born. And KT this winter, we have a property, 240 acres, that we just conserved with the Vermont Land Trust, and we're having our own timber harvest this coming winter. And I'm so excited. I've been learning so much, and it's going to be so healthy for that forest. And we're going to be able to use it also as an education opportunity, put signage up, have a educational walk with the public out into the land so they can see what the plans are for the operation, and what the aftermath, the positive impact will be after the operation. And there are so many other really cool examples that I think our community hosts. My favorite is the Tiki Bar in downtown East Burke. I mean, it just is the epitome of the Northeast Kingdom cross-sector industries. You know, there's obviously it's parking for Kingdom Trails, there's trailhead access, there's food trucks there, so you have the ag and food industry, there's murals on the bathroom, so the creative industry is present, and there's music there at night. But on the back of that Tiki Bar, Mike's Tiki Bar, is Mike's sawmill, you know, and it's a productive sawmill. And so it's just this like amazing intersection of what makes the Northeast Kingdom, the new working landscape. So it's exciting. I just think it's an example, and we can all lead to that. And again, that I've talked about people from away, the city folk, you know, and I think I was one of them at one point, when I used to see the drastic difference that a timber harvest does have on land. You think the Lorax, or you think clear cutting, and that's not the case. This is an absolute opportunity to educate folks on the healthy benefits that a timber harvest can have for land.
So I want to move a little bit into land or protecting access. That you all have you're all working with some multiple ways to do that. Josh, you talked about how you have some of your land was in permanent easement, some you have annual license agreements, some is based on a handshake. Mike, I think it's similar. The Access Fund owns some land. Abby, similar. Kingdom Trails has actually gotten into land acquisition. Sean's land is under conservation easement with under an easement with the state. And we had a question as well about someone wondering about working with land, like marketing the conservation easement opportunity to landowners. So, hey, you could actually get some value if you were to conserve your land. You can get some property tax benefits, but some people are not always too keen on locking up their land forever, even if they do have some kind of tax benefit. So I'm curious to know more about how you all approach these different types of land access protection mechanisms, what seems to have worked well, what people are resistant to, or whether it's just completely situational and this question is sort of moot because everything's going to be based on a different situation.
I think it is very situational. With that said, we certainly have had great success over the years acquiring lands from willing sellers. Access Fund, we don't hold a lot of land in fee because we are a larger national organization. We do acquire land, we'll hold it for a period of time and usually turn it over to a local interest, whether it's a public land manager, a land trust, or a local climbing organization. But we have conserved about, we've done 80 acquisitions over the history of our 30-year existence in the Access Fund. And we actually have what we call the Climbing Conservation Loan Program, which is a pot of money we fundraised for back in 2009 that we've achieved $3.3 million in acquisition or lands acquired, and also granted around $600,000 in grants to local entities that are acquiring lands for conservation. And so really it is just figuring out what the interest of the landowner is. Really for me, it's the lowest, the most simple tool we can deploy is the best tool and the one that fits best with the landowner's long-term goals. A lot of landowners like the idea of seeing their land conserved in perpetuity, and we can offer that opportunity. But sometimes it's deploying a limited agreement that might have might extend for 3 years and define parameters of use and offer a vehicle for additional insured status and that sort of thing. So yeah, it is really it depends on the person for sure.
Yeah, I would just say very situational, and yeah, we have had some success, really in just one instance, protecting a really critical access across roughly a mile of private land to a wilderness area and part of our Jackrabbit ski trail route, which would be just completely critical section of the trail, where we were able to negotiate an easement right of way across that property and purchase that from the landowner. My sense is that worked because the landowner was another organization and not a private landowner. I'm not sure it would have went through with just an individual. And that's just kind of based on other experiences trying to get those kinds of permanent protections, especially for really critical connections between different pieces of public land, where it's not just sort of our use that we're concerned about, but the larger public use of the trail corridor. And my experience has been that most people are really hesitant to, to put those permanent agreements in place in whatever fashion they are, whether it's an easement corridor or an entire easement on the property. More recently, we've worked, we're not a land trust ourselves, but we've started to work with regional land trusts in our area in a variety of ways. And that's probably our biggest success outside of the Jackrabbit Trail, and that model is beginning to work with our land trusts in the area to actually identify properties that are coming on the market, or in one instance where a property owner wanted to donate a large tract and an adjacent tract was able to be purchased and create a community preserve and a trail connecting the hamlet to an adjacent trail system. So I think in the future, that's probably more the approach that we would take versus trying to negotiate things directly with landowners.
Thanks, Josh. Sean?
Yeah, just added to a point that Mike made is that, every landowner and every piece of property is so different, and that you do really need to go in with an open mind and a wide range of tools that you could present to a landowner. I can think that, on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have a piece of property that's absolutely critical to access or to a network of trails. And, that's the kind of one where you want to do the full court press on everything that's possible because that property is so important. But then you're going to have other properties that it's like, well, if it doesn't work out and they don't want that trail, we have options. We can kind of go around it. So you don't, I don't want to say you don't want to waste your time there, but, you got to kind of think about the range of importance, but then you're really up to the particular landowner. And one of the question was asked about donations of conservation easements, and that is a very good tool. The only real downside to it is that it's an income tax credit, so you need to have income and you have to be paying taxes to get the full benefit of the donation. So if you are a large landowner or a landowner with 100 acres and you don't have a lot of income and not paying a lot of taxes, but you have value in your land, that's the one kind of downside, is if you are land rich, cash poor, you don't necessarily get the income tax credit. But it is very good tool. Vermont Land Trust has been very successful in conserving a lot of important properties over the years using that method.
Thanks, Sean. I want to get to some of the questions that people have posed. One person says, there was recently a trail that was being worked on by a local organization, and many of the people who live nearby were concerned that what was previously a secret trail amongst them and their neighbors would be ruined by crowds and trash and graffiti, et cetera, once it became a more formal trail. And how might you approach that kind of conversation with local landowners who have some concern about, like, what does it mean now that our secret trail is going to be more open? Or crag, could be same. It's a crag that used to be kind of stealth and is no longer.
I'll weigh in reluctantly. I guess I guess my first question would be, who owns the land? Is it public land that's adjacent to private property, and the local adjacent landowners are basically enjoying exclusive access to something that maybe should be open to the public or could be open to the public with more trail infrastructure. And I realize that increased public use, that the concern about crowds or trash or graffiti is maybe prevalent out there. In our experience, that just doesn't happen very often. And if anything, we've found that trail development on parcels where there are existing social trails that have been used, maybe neighborhood use for a long time, and then you start to see more public use. If anything, those lands and those trails get cleaned up, and you have less of those issues because there's more use and more investment in stewarding the property.
Thanks, Josh. Abby?
Yeah, I agree. I was just going to share that probably their main concern is and before they do choose to make it public, is what is going to be managing that trail, who's going to be doing that maintenance and cleanup. And I do think by making it public and having an organization or a group of dedicated volunteers put in place by the town, could be another option, will be helpful in the long run for the sustainability of that trail, because many rogue trails or secret trails give trail organizations a bad name because those rogue trails actually weren't made properly. They maybe are causing more erosion or weren't following, the IMBA Sweet Single Track Solutions, those books that are there for best management practices. And so by having some sort of dedicated effort behind a trail, that could actually be better for the land and the private landowner. Mm-hmm.
I think you're both kind of touching on something that relates to a question that has come in around donation boxes. And so this person had been asking about whether if someone put a donation box on their land, would that impact their liability protection? And I think from my understanding, the answer would be yes, if they were trying to collect that money themselves. But you all are nonprofit organizations who are responsible for managing trails, for building trails, for doing the access work and legal and policy work that Access Fund is. So you for sure all could use donations, but that cannot go to the landowner, but it can go to you all for building and stewarding the land and the recreation access. So I would encourage anyone who is on here to be generous in their donations to your organizations, which can then create the positive impact on the land and for recreators. So I just wanted to kind of touch on a response to that question that may benefit you all. Someone else is asking, can you discuss issues and creative solutions to the parking demands where people may not want people parking on their lawn? I think Abby's a little excited to answer that one.
Parking is my favorite subject. It keeps me up at night, really, actually. Yes, parking's an issue. And to add to that, it's the 3 Ps is what I like to refer to, the parking, the people, and the poop. That is, you need, every trail organization or every recreational opportunity needs to have that supporting infrastructure in place before they can even go forth with their recreation opportunity. And KT, you know, I did already share about the restricted access. That was due to the pressure and stress created by the amount of trail users that were visiting our network prior to the pandemic. And it came to a head. That was shown. And I knew it was coming to a head when I arrived at KT 4 years ago. And so we actually pursued, and it's on our website, and I invite everybody to look at it as an example for their own areas. But we pursued a USDA funded capacity study. We really needed help to look at our trail network holistically and deem where proper parking should be and facilities should be, and safe traffic flow, and how to relieve congestion. And after that capacity study, which I'm really proud was a public engagement process, our landowners were at the table, our community members, local leaders, business owners were all there. And we're now left with this gift of recommendations and solutions to go forth and take action on and implement. And we've already been taking action, you know, with safe road and trail crossings, connector trails to mitigate those bikes off the roads and onto the trail to relieve that different conflict of bikers and cars. And even looking at, of course, parking infrastructure needs to be there at the trailheads. And one of the biggest actions we're going to pursue now with another USDA grant is a potential community hub. Where can trail users go to get information about the trail, about the community? Is there space for programming and office space? And so we're looking at that as an outdoor recreation community hub for our community in the next couple of years to serve our trail users and our landowners.
Yeah, Maura, can I add to that?
Yes.
I think the parking is a great challenge, I think, with all use, but I think the other part of understanding capacity is understanding the capacity to monitor and enforce the rights that are out there. And KT's doing it through trail stewards, other people do it through volunteers. You know, some of the recreational use that happens on our property, you know, especially snowmobiles, and we rely on more of the legal law enforcement side of things for many. And the challenge there is, if those things need to grow together. As you're expanding the use and you're inviting more people, you have to be able to monitor and enforce the expanded use. And I think one of the challenges that we've experienced collectively in the Northeast is that the use got way out ahead of the monitoring and enforcing, and it takes a while for that capacity of parking and trash barrels and porta potties and to kind of catch up. So there is a bit of a growing pain that happens anytime you have additional or new and then you have the locals that have been using the secret trail complaining about everybody that's there, and it's the reality. But I will say that monitoring, making sure you have a monitoring and enforcement, whatever that is, plan as part of the expanded use is critical.
Yeah, and going back to the donation box, right? It's about investment, having the ability to invest in these proper management strategies and techniques. And then also being able to invest in new areas to kind of spread people out, right? I mean, but when we think about a lot of the, land management challenges we see, whether it's private, public land, oftentimes the biggest issue is that investment, the ability to actually fund proper management strategies that you need to be deployed. And we've become so accustomed, I think, to underfunded federal agencies and state parks, and we just think that that's how it has to be. But the reality is, with the proper funding, these sorts of these issues can be managed effectively. There are examples out there across the country that show it.
I think there's been some interesting movement among funders to be more open to funding infrastructure type things, to recognizing that some of these very fundamental things are required. Abby mentioned that USDA Rural Development has put money into the capacity study, potentially into the Recreation Community Center. The Northern Forest Center has gotten a variety of grants to support that kind of infrastructure. That there's, I think, just greater recognition that you can't just like build new stuff. Hooray, we have more miles of trail. There's a whole lot that has to go along with that in order for it to be sustainable and work for a community, and not just like, now we have more trails to play on or whatever it may be. I want to give each of you a chance to share anything now that you have really been wanting to say and haven't gotten a chance to, if anything comes to mind as we move toward closing by 1:30. Maybe what do you want to leave people with? If somebody's struggling with how to maintain or offer access to land, what do you want them to know?
I would, I would encourage them to reach out to any of us, any of like organizations that might be present in wherever they're working or wherever they own land. Reach out to your local land trust. Reach out, explore your nonprofit networks. It's a great thing that these organizations have we're growing and becoming more visible, and our capacities are becoming larger, and our ability to manage land and understand how to manage land are growing, and are, I think, ahead of the curve. Again, it comes back to the ability to kind of deploy the tools because there's a funding need there. Just I'd say these sorts of webinars, Northern Forest Center, look to your local resources and see who's out there, and then reach out and start a conversation.
I'll just say two things quickly. One, when it comes to approaching individual landowners, and especially if you're in an area or community where you have existing access to private lands for trails or otherwise, that sort of peer-to-peer contact can be really crucial for gaining permission. We've had plenty of instances where our attempts to work with a landowner have failed, but where other landowners in our network were able to make progress with that person, either through personal relationships or just asking them to sort of share their experience, so maybe alleviate some of the concerns. And the other thing is just future planning. And I think this is especially important, in a model like our Jackrabbit Trail, where we have multiple landowners contiguously, in order to, we may be crossing 4 or 5 parcels to get from point A to point B. And if one of those access to one of those places is taken away, then it's a house of cards, and the whole thing collapses. So just thinking ahead about those kinds of situations, and investing a lot in, establishing a trail where you're really relying on many people to continue supporting it for a long time, and knowing that one person saying no can change it overnight. So I think that's crucial for just looking ahead to the future.
I would just share my words of wisdom are that you must listen and learn from your landowners, because they are truly providing a gift. And I think if the past 2 years during the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that outdoor recreation is essential. It was a space that provided, critical mental and physical health benefits to people in such an isolating time. They could gather safely together and lift their spirits and clear their minds, fortify their bodies. And that is just truly valuable. And those private landowners, again, with no benefit, are providing that.
Thanks, Abby. Thoughts from Sean?
So since I'm kind of been on the panel as a private landowner, I'm going to answer as a recreational user. And, you know, I think everybody's seen that over the last couple of years of the pandemic, the explosion of outdoor recreational use, right? You couldn't buy a mountain bike forever, skis, everything was in so demand. And we saw, you know, every sort of recreational use just get a lot more pressure and population, which is a great thing. But I think that for me, the words of wisdom is that we as recreational users need to use every opportunity that we can to educate and speak to our friends and, you know, the people that we ski with and ride with and hunt with and fish with, that, you know, educating the user side is probably one of the most important things we can do to continue to allow private landowners to let us use their property.
I think that's a great way to wrap up, Sean. And we all have a responsibility here. So thank you all so much. I love this conversation. We could keep talking a long time. We will send out a recording of this presentation along with our panelists' contact information. I would also invite you to join us in a couple months to talk about building a strong workforce in the region. There will be outdoor recreation elements in that conversation, but looking at more broadly, how can we build more careers here? How can we get more people to the region to fill existing jobs? That's going to be a great conversation, and registration is open now at the link provided. Finally, I want to acknowledge USDA Rural Development, a wonderful organization or agency and partner that has been so generous in a lot of things related to outdoor recreation and building local capacity. So thank you all so much. Look forward to seeing you out in the Northern Forest and hopefully at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.